Well, this is a good question. The actual fallout from the war in the West, I think, is unclear. I don't think that there will be a big change of mood in support for the Ukraine. I think that is most likely to continue. But to what extent people in the West are willing to pay the price for that, I think is a much more difficult question, because really there's a big economic crisis brewing in the West now because of this huge increase in prices that is taking place, mainly oil and gas, but not only oil and gas. So we're back into an inflationary situation. And I think that's going to, I think this kind of economic convulsion is going to result in a lot of political volatility and unpredictability. And I wouldn't really like to say, well, it's going to go this way or going to go that way. I think it's very difficult to say at the moment what's going to happen. I mean, clearly in the short run, the most obvious political effect has been to galvanize the Western alliance in a way we've not seen since the end of the Cold War. That is a new phenomenon, because actually the phenomenon in the relationship between Europe and the United States since 1991 has been, and the end of the Cold War, has been a process of slowly a gap opening up steadily between Europe and the United States. I mean, there was an interesting opinion poll about a year ago, sort of after Trump, European attitudes towards the States, and they were very, they were more negative than they've been at any point, I suppose, since 1945. And now I think that's reversed. I mean, the most dramatic example of it is the country that's been actually, in my view, the most sensible in Europe for a long time, which is Germany. And Germany has now decided, that as support of the war effort is going to increase its military expenditure by a lot. I mean, this is a common now across Europe. Countries are going to spend more, a lot more. Germany's talking about, I can't remember what the figure is. I think it's at 100 billion euros on defense. I mean, Germany has been, essentially quite pacifist in many ways in its foreign policy. So I think it's very difficult to say. You asked me about Biden and the United States. Could Biden get return? I think this is difficult. I mean, I think there are a number of factors playing. Biden is very old now, and he comes across as very old. So whether he can, win the election on the back of a war, which is, it's not even, it's got 2 years before the election. So whether he can win it, I don't know. I mean, it is true that, by the way, that, and I've written about this and talked about it, that this kind of polarization of American politics, which was underpinning, which was such a dramatic feature of what was happening in Washington, D.C. There's one issue on which, there are two issues now on which America is not divided. One is China, and the other is the Ukraine. So, I mean, I think I would have to conclude from what's happening so far that, that Russia's action has had, from the point of view, of Europe and the West, very negative consequences, because it strengthened the position of the United States. It strengthened the old Western alliance. There's been a lot of negative consequences coming from this, and now you've got an economic crisis. Now, in the longer run, what exactly? I can't predict what the longer term ramifications are going to be. I mean, if Germany, for example, if they decide, this is one possibility, that if European countries which are very dependent, like Germany, above all, on Russian oil and gas, decide they're not going to have it anymore, I mean, that is going to lead to huge economic problems in Germany. Huge. In Britain, not so much, because we don't get much oil from Russia, and we don't get that much gas. I think it's about 20%, 10 or 20, maybe 10%, something quite small, relatively speaking. Oh, I think it's actually very straightforward. I think that Germany, for a long time since the Cold War, but especially under Angela Merkel, had sought sort of, the old sort of Ostpolitik to find a way of working with Russia and an acceptance of Russia and the need for coexistence with Russia. But I think that for German politicians and German people, I mean, you're not just talking about the politicians, there was a red line. And the red line was, Russia can't start invading countries. And that's what's changed it. No one thought this was possible, actually. And I think that's why there was a reluctance to believe that American intelligence, which proved very accurate, actually, that Putin was going to invade. Europeans didn't really believe that was going to happen, nor did the Ukrainians, by the way, I don't think. But it did happen. And I think that's what then Germany was left in a very difficult situation, where basically its foreign policy that it pursued for quite a long time fell apart in that situation. And Germany became, like France, like Britain. I mean, there were two figures two leaders in Europe, Macron and Scholz, who really tried to find a way of reaching out to Russia before the invasion. And they've both been very weakened by this. Well, I have to say to you that there's overwhelming opposition in the UK to the Russian, I'm going to call it an invasion or military action in the Ukraine. And I think it's been a really big shock, actually, for people, because the people aren't used to that in Europe. I mean, of course, Europe used to be the continent where, there were sort of non-stop wars over a very, very long historical period. But since 1945, and especially since the Cold War finished, we haven't really experienced anything like that. So it's come as a huge shock to people. And seeing the pictures on the television in a European country of this happening has really had a huge effect on public opinion, not just in the UK, but across Europe. I mean, really has led to a very, very big political shift across Europe against Russia. I think that it's very different in other parts of the world. I know it's felt very differently in East Asia. And I think people probably feel more neutral about it in other parts of the world, and feel quite remote from it. In fact, it's quite a reversal of the normal situation, because generally wars have been taking place around it, not in Europe, but in other parts of the world, notably in the Middle East. And the attitude of Europeans towards those is I mean, it's somewhere else. So even the Iraq War, eventually there was huge opposition to the Iraq War, of course, in Britain and other European countries, but it took quite a time for that to really build up. But people don't feel the same connection. I think this is partly a kind of racial mentality, to be honest with you. This is, a white people in a European country, so they can relate to it. Whereas if it is involved in Yemen, for example, where the death toll is hugely greater, they don't relate to it in the same way. So I think that's an important observation to make, to try and understand why Europe feels so strongly. There's also a certain element of what I shall call a myopic attention to the war, and because if you go back to before the Cold War, then Europe was the epicenter of the world, because the Cold War, really, the line of division in the Cold War was through Germany, through the Berlin Wall and so on. That was where the old Iron Curtain was. So Europe, until that moment, was the center of the world. And now that, of course, as soon as the Cold War came to an end, that whole picture changed. There were underlying changes that were already leading to that. But the most important was China and the rise of East Asia. So the center of gravity of the world has shifted somewhere else. It's certainly not in Europe anymore. I mean, Europe is now much less important than it was previously. But this war has sort of, been a rerun of historical experience. The division is, between, Russia and Europe, Russia and Western Europe and the United States. So it's, to some extent, there's a sort of, it's a kind of return to what it seemed to be before, with Europe being at the center of things.